I'm Janet Forrest, and this is the Nantucket Atheneum podcast. In this season of the podcast, my colleague James Greider and I are going to take you on a journey through time. You'll find out about the faces and frivolities that graced, or maybe disgraced, the stage of the Great Hall. You'll meet musicians, lecturers, and illusionists, some of repute and some, well, not. Who were these folks that made the long 30-mile trek to Nantucket, and how were they received by the islanders? Welcome to Tonight in Atheneum Hall. This is Episode 3, Impresarios of the Stage. On Tuesday, April 14th, 1840, the following advertisement appeared in the Islander.
At the Atheneum for this night only, Signor Blitz, the greatest and most amusing professor of physical, experimental, wonderful, surprising, philosophical, and incomprehensible thaumaturgic, has the honor to announce to the ladies and gentlemen of Nantucket and its vicinity that by particular request of several families, he will give his amusements as above stated this evening, and he hopes from the unqualified approbation bestowed on his entertainments in 22 states of the Union to receive the support of the citizens of Nantucket.
James, tell me what we're going to be talking about today.
Today we're going to talk about impresarios of the stage who've appeared at the Atheneum. Think of the Music Man coming to town and bringing with him a lot of excitement about his performance because it was something different and new in the small town. And that's the kind of performer we're going to be talking about today. And it really all starts with a fellow named Yankee Hill. His name was George Handel Hill. He was an American actor born in Boston. He took to the stage as what was called a personator. He would perform as a character on stage that would sort of typify what was seen as, for example, the typical Yankee, hence his nickname Yankee Hill. He became associated with that particular stock character. In fact, so much and so ingrained did that character become in sort of the American iconography that his character was actually sort of the origin of Uncle Sam, of that image of the man with the striped pants and the blue swallowtail coat. He actually appears on a flower tin at one point. So he really captured the American imagination in the 1840s. He would travel all over the country. He really culminated with his career around the Civil War. He was here on Nantucket about a decade or so before that. The image that he portrayed was of a stock character called Brother Jonathan, who would wear, as I mentioned before, these tight striped trousers, very bright waistcoat, an old-fashioned coat like a swallowtail coat with large buttons, and very large boots. And it would be seen in advertising everywhere. It was on tobacco tins. He was kind of a transatlantic cousin of John Bull, the English character, who was sort of seen as the typical male citizen of the country, the man on the street. Yankee Hill typified or personified what we came to see later on in Mark Twain's The Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. He's simple in the sense that he's unaffected in his character, but he had a cunning or a cleverness to him, especially when it came to sniffing out a good deal, that he would always get the better over on these people that he was being looked down upon by, who were of a different class. And he always would come out on top as a result of this. And so he would travel around the country and put on these various characters, and Yankee Hill was the most popular of those characters that he would portray.
And what was it about that time, or what was going on in the country that drew people to him?
At that time, Americans were really looking to understand their own character as a nation. We were trying to forge our own identity. The 1840s, 1850s, and we were starting to really feel confident as a nation, but we didn't know how to express that in some ways. And so these were people that were searching for a way to epitomize what they were seeing every day on the street and sort of bring that to a wider audience going abroad later on to perform in the UK and elsewhere, and really give people a sense of what the man on the street, the average Yankee, might be. Now, of course, at that time, it applied to all of the colonies, not just sort of regionally New England or so that kind of thing. he really paved the way for a lot of other performers we're going to talk about in a little bit who would sort of enlarge on just simply that stock character representation by adding either additional acts or skills or performances or other characters, and also do it much more quickly. So whereas Yankee Hill would, portray the Yankee in a little sketch that might go on for some time with other characters that he'd be engaging with, some of the other performers just simply performed by themselves on stage. And here I'm thinking in particular of a fellow named Dr. Valentine, who was famous for his comic Metamorphoses. He would sit in a little booth and had a variety of disguises that he would put on while he was also performing lectures, comic songs, again, providing that kind of homespun kind of wisdom at the same time. He would play a variety of characters, and he would switch between those, ducking down to the side or drawing the little curtain. I'm not exactly sure how the mechanism worked, but there's a great picture of him in his booth with the curtain kind of like a little swag on either side of him. And some of his characters today would be considered fairly offensive because, of course, they would involve some kind of blackface. But he would also do sort of the Irishman, the Dutchman. Dr. Valentine got his start with P.T. Barnum when variety theater was really just sort of becoming a thing in 1842, 1843, where there would be a series of variety comedy sketches, songs, dance, acrobatics, magic acts, that kind of thing. And a relatively small group of headline artists were sort of the mainstay of the repertoire, and they would specialize in these representations of people from different classes. So the reason William Valentine was particularly popular with Barnum is that Dr. Valentine would stand at the entrance to the museum, and he would study the characters of the visitors that were coming in. And based upon that, he would sort of change his act. He would always panic, apparently, if he thought they were country bumpkins who wouldn't respond to the diversity of his repertoire. But he also drew from the people that he saw coming in. So as I said, he had this table, a little shelf, he had hooks on there with caps and wigs and mustaches, shirt collars, and you really could only see him from the waist up. And he would address the audience seated behind this table and then state his intention, just like you're told not to do today. I'm going to do an impression of Jack Nicholson. Like, if you have to tell people, maybe it's not a great impression. But at the same time, this was all brand new for the audiences that were seeing this. And so he would do different characters, both male and female, including the Yankee Tin Peddler, Tabitha Twist, who was a young maiden, Sam Slick Jr., a precocious author, a man named Mr. Sauerkraut. You saw the pictures I sent you. Mr. Sauerkraut looks like he would be named Mr. Sauerkraut. There's Jemima Doolittle, who was a widowed woman, and also Seth Stokes, one of his most popular characters, who was kind of like the 19th century version of Night at the Roxbury. He thought that his character thought he really understood women and what they wanted, and in the portrayal would show that he knew absolutely nothing about women or what they wanted.
You mentioned that when people were coming in, he was observing the audience because he was trying to customize his act.
Yes.
And was the point to kind of hold up a mirror and show these people kind of who they are so they can laugh together? And it was all in good fun? Or was he more of an insult comic and he was kind of making fun of the people?
I don't get a sense that he was making fun of them. I think it was an honest attempt to represent it. I think it feels more like he was, or at least my impression is, he was more like not a journalist, but a journalist in the sense of journaling about American culture and people that he met. And so he just, by studying the audience, he was trying to keep current with what he was seeing as a rapidly changing social environment with different groups and people coming to the fore and trying to find a way to connect to the audience. I don't get the impression that there was any mean-spiritedness to it. That seems to be more of a 20th century thing from what I'm seeing. They were very earnest, even while they were doing very horrible things, it seems like in the past. That sense of irony wasn't quite there until I think a little bit later on. At least that was my impression, which is not to say that there weren't some things that today, in retrospect, seem very mean-spirited. And one of the lists you can see, and you can peruse all these things online, were different characters or situations that would be considered, whether there would be sort of a sexist approach to something, clearly racist was obviously an issue at the time, or at least is now for us, whereas when they were performing these things, they would think nothing of performing in blackface, and that was a very popular form of entertainment at the time. So though in retrospect, it seems like it is a bit cruel what they were doing at the time, I think it was perceived as being, hey, look at this new nation that we have here, all these different characters. Some of them they're meant to be poked fun at, like Mr. Sauerkraut. And I think he makes it very explicit, kind of like Charles Dickens does with his characters. When you read the name, you have a good sense of what that character is all about. Dr. Valentine would sometimes perform with a fellow named Signor Blitz, both here on Nantucket, where they did appear on stage together, but also further afield. And Signor Blitz was very popular throughout the country. He was known for, in particular, catching a bullet in his hands, which he did eventually have to give up for being too dangerous.
Did he actually catch a bullet in his hands, or was it stagecraft?
Well, I mean, the way that I always understood that trick is you have palmed a bullet, and then the gun is a blank is fired, and then you grab it. So whether or not he just simply said he didn't want to do it anymore because it was too dangerous, or he just got sick of doing it, and that was the excuse that he gave. Because I agree, if they were shooting a bullet at him, that would be very dangerous. And I'm not sure how the physics of that would work.
I can see both sides, because you think back to when they used to, I guess some places still do, throw knives, that sort of thing. They did very silly, dangerous, wildly dangerous things.
Yes.
So I don't think performers would be past doing that. I'm just curious if it was possible, but they also were quite skilled at stagecraft, and the audience perhaps was a little bit more gullible than.
Right. And whereas today we have all of these sort of behind the scenes, like Penn and Teller, that sort of show you how the trick was done, especially if it's the first time anybody has ever done that trick. Wow, that guy just caught a bullet.
Yeah.
Like, holy cow, you got to see that. It's amazing. So yeah, but like you're saying, I think it really could go either way. Either it was stagecraft, or they just had horrible health and safety regulations in the day and took a lot more chances than the insurance company would allow us to do today at the Atheneum, for example. Was a funny looking little man. I say that as one myself. You're definitely drawn to him when you see him. He's a very distinct look. He was born over in England in 1810. His name was Antonio Van Zandt, we think. Not really sure because we don't have any birth records. But we do know that he began performing on stage at the age of 13 in Germany as Signor Blitz. He would advertise that he was not, in fact, British, but that he was Moravian. He was from Germany because he found he could get more work in England as a foreigner. So again, just kind of part of the image. So he traveled around first to the UK, then he went further afield to Northern Europe, Ireland and Scotland before coming to the US in 1834. He performed in New York City. He traveled around North America before eventually settling in Philadelphia, where he lived until he passed away in 1877. But as I said, he came to Nantucket on a number of occasions. It was very popular here. There are stories in the paper of kids trying to do some of the sleight of hand tricks, and they're out on the street, they're doing it with like a piece of paper or something, and they're dropping it, and they don't know how all the steps are. But the adults got a kick out of the kids trying to imitate this famous magician. He was also known as a ventriloquist. He really liked using that skill to cause a bit of mischief, I guess you could say, while he was on the road. For example, he once made a bunch of people at a train station think there was a boy in a big cello case that was trapped inside there and couldn't get out. And he really amused himself, I guess, while he was waiting for the train by fooling all these people who were in great consternation for this child. Opened the case up and it was empty. They had no idea what to do with that, Again, because ventriloquism was brand new, at least as an entertainment. And he was very popular for many, many years across the country. He was well known for making things like omelets appear and hats. He would produce canary birds from watch cases, rabbits from waistcoat pockets, butterflies from eggshells. He even had some trained birds, trained canaries, one of which he could make play dead on command. Whenever it was known that he was coming to Nantucket, people would get very excited about that. And in fact, his reputation here became such that it formed the basis of an anecdote from his autobiography. When he was writing about visiting Nantucket back in the day, he stopped at the Pacific Bank at the top of Main Street, and there he asked an elderly Quaker gentleman he wanted to cash a check basically for $300. Well, here's this funny little man with two big tufts of hair on his head coming into the bank. He probably barely reached the counter, and the man is looking down on him, very tall and gaunt and serious looking. And he says, as he's noticing as Blitz is filling it out, he's signing the check, Signor Blitz, which presumably would be bank fraud today, but at the time that was what he was known as. And The gentleman in the bank saw this and was very excited. You're Signor Blitz? Really? Are you really Signor Blitz? And of course, Blitz took that opportunity then to show him that he in fact was a magician. He performed some feats that so surprised this poor banker gentleman that he turned to his assistant and said, "Hey, get all the money back in the vault. This guy's trouble, basically." He just really thought that Blitz could just reach behind the counter from where he was on the other side and take all of this money. And who knows, maybe he could have. Maybe he was that good. I guess a lot of the people in the bank at the time got quite a chuckle out of it because they probably had been to his show and knew what he was up to. The older Quaker gentleman, maybe not the type that would attend a magic show at the Atheneum at the time, so it wasn't really sort of up on the act, as it were. And when he died in 1877, his obituaries ran in newspapers throughout the country. He was just so well known. He was sort of the best known of the magicians that came here and performed. And there were a couple of others who achieved also great fame abroad and here as well. For example, the other character was Jonathan Harrington, who was one of the earliest American magicians. He was born in Boston, so he was locally grown and raised, began performing as a ventriloquist, and then added different acts to his repertoire, including fire resistance, conjuring, and exhibitions. And his shows became increasingly focused on magic with some ventriloquism and mimicry mixed in with that. He was described as a professor of ventriloquism and natural magic. He performed throughout the 1830s and the 1840s in Boston at the Lowell Museum, which was a theater, even though it was called a museum. They had different names. Theater was a bad word in the 1840s and 50s. Have you ever heard of the Astor Place riot?
I have. I read a whole book about it.
Okay. So, they had this reputation as kind of lawless places, and some of them, like the Bowery Street Theater, you'd have people up on stage with the performers, like gambling and drinking and just hanging out.
Yeah, and just for the listeners who aren't familiar with it, the Astor Place riot there was a theater, and correct me if I got any of this wrong. They were doing Shakespeare, and there were the two premier Shakespearean actors, and one was British and one was American, and it was sort of like a dance-off between these two, a very violent dance-off, and finally the fans of either got out of control. And I do believe that's how the New York City police force was originally founded, after the Astor riots.
It was a big deal. It was a really big deal. And it lasted for a day or two, I think, as well. Yeah. So it was a big moment in New York history, and sort of theaters in general had this reputation of being a place you would not bring the family. Exactly.
It wasn't people getting dressed up in tuxes, and it was like a brawl. It was a bar. It was mayhem.
It must have been complete chaos, and it must have been hard to hear the actors amidst all of that, the noise going on. There are some amazing engravings that I've seen of just the chaos that was on stage at that time, which is why some places they would name them the Atheneum, even though it wasn't necessarily a library, or they would call it the public garden, even though it wasn't actually a garden, but it was a way to euphemize this place so that families could go, that it was a more appropriate venue to go and be entertained. So he did really well, this Jonathan Harrington, to the point where he was able to buy his own theater, the New England Museum, again, not a theater, called a theater, where he presented shows and exhibitions, including The Burning of Moscow, which we're going to talk about later with the panoramas. But eventually tired of that, he sold the museum, went back on the road, performing throughout New England with additional trips to Philadelphia and other places around the country. Signed on with P.T. Barnum for a while. Again, P.T. Barnum drew a lot of these types of people to his venues because it was a great place to put on a performance and make your name. As he aged, he became known as Old Harrington, which is a heck of a thing to be called when there's no young Harrington in the offing. It's just me, just Harrington. And again, when he passed away, these were, like Signor Blitz, these were national celebrities who were bringing something entirely new, this new experience to the stage for everyday Americans who'd never experienced anything like this before. And one of the common complaints in the paper is how many people come to these events and how few come to the lectures, which they think would be better for people to attend, more informative educational.
Right. Not much has changed.
Yeah. You probably had some experience with that in your day. the last one I would mention is a man named Andrew MacAllister. He was on Nantucket in 1853 performing at the Atheneum. He trained with a magician in France named Philippe Talon. Philippe had a small wooden theater in Glasgow. While he was performing there, he met a young bricklayer, Andrew MacAllister, who had a natural genius for making models and creating intricate tricks. And he became Philippe's apprentice, known as Domingo, unfortunately wearing blackface makeup in retrospect. But again, at the time, this was sort of a stock character that was seen performing on stage. Eventually, though, he broke out and became his own magician, and he claims to have invented the bottle trick, the inexhaustible bottle trick, in which he was able to pour 22 different kinds of liquor from one bottle, which must have astounded the audience who'd never seen like a soda machine at McDonald's before. We just see that as sort of a natural, well, maybe not natural, but an easily explained phenomenon. This must have astounded them. And again, it was done with a series of tubes and so forth, so that he was able to create this illusion of pouring all these different liquors. But he also had, he created Harlequin automata, which is essentially a ventriloquist dummy that would move independently of him holding it. And he would speak to it and ask questions and so forth. And he had the most amazing costume. The other folks, we see them, they're kind of in a frock coat or looking very 19th century. As you can see from some of the photos that I included there, he really went all in with the performances, with the costumes. There's a photo of him in these large robes in front of these smoking braziers, and he's performing, he's pulling rabbits out of the hat or whatever. His costume was kind of a combination of those worn by his mentors, other magicians that he'd met. He created this sort of phantasmagorical look about him that really stood out from the other people who were on stage at the time.
It must have been really fascinating for an audience member, even if you can kind of see through the trick and see what they're doing. It's still something you've never seen before. Like, you've never seen any kind of performance like it. Regardless of how sophisticated it is, and some of it was, it just must have been fascinating and so magical, like, odd choice of words, but like really magical to see something you'd really never seen before. Absolutely.
And at a time when I think in a lot of people's minds, these different ways of understanding the world or the universe were not clearly delineated or debunked or categorized. And so maybe mesmerism does work, and maybe magic is real. Maybe we're using steam to create all these different effects. Science and magic were so sort of close in terms of their ability to transform the world, apparently, that it might have been even more of a shock and more of a something that you would take to heart, because what you're seeing is something that is literally magic. Whereas we understand it today, we understand it's sleight of hand or something else. But as you said, it was a magical experience in the true sense of the word, just as it would be to see a steam engine for the first time if you've never heard of a steam engine before, and just kind of lump them all together as being this new wonder of the world. It would take decades for all of these things to kind of shake themselves out, establish which was illusion and which was.
How did the audiences of the Atheneum respond to this? Signor Blitz came back several times, so he must have had a lively audience. Was there any contention or any controversy over people enjoying this or wanting to go to this?
Not in the sense that there was any kind of religious objection to it necessarily, at least that I've seen. I think that at the time, Nantucket was fairly cosmopolitan in some ways, even though it was also very sheltered in other ways. But it was a city on the sea. There were people coming from all over the world. It was not controversial, but it was remarkable when they would perform on stage. People had, again, never seen anything like that before. And it was their first time experiencing this, and in a way that was so immediate. We're oftentimes these days limited by the video screen that we're looking at. Live performance is obviously a very different experience in general, but with magic in particular, where, you might think, they stopped the video, they moved something. When you see it in front of your eyes, that coin disappears or whatever it is, it does, even today, for me, still has that feeling of like even though I know what he's done with it, it still gets you that first that first moment, I think. All of them kind of were working with completely new material and just feeling their way through all of this. And so you would see a lot of overlap between the various disciplines that have evolved over time. And they were just trying to see whatever worked, basically, to get their audience to react, to get them to come back and put people in the seats. It was a novel experience for a lot of Americans who had never seen anything like this before. I know I keep going back to that, but I think it's important to emphasize that what we now see is like, oh, this is the guy that shows up at my kid's birthday party and ties balloon animals. That there was a time when these were kind of like rock stars, and they were seen as being on par with the athletes today, or authors, or movie stars, or things of that sort, and were known around the world. And when they left the stage, as it were, people acknowledged that passing, and they were glad they'd had a chance to see them in person.
This has been a production of the Nantucket Atheneum. It was hosted and edited by me, Janet Forrest. Special thanks to Reference Library Associate James Greider for his knowledge and research. The opening announcement was voiced by Andrew Cromartie. Please check the show notes for more information and references. You can find all the previous episodes of this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now. Please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. If you have an idea for what we should talk about next, send us an email at jforrest@nantucketatheneum.org. The Nantucket Atheneum is located at 1 India Street in Nantucket, Massachusetts. We would love for you to stop by. You can find us online at nantucketatheneum.org or search at Nantucket Atheneum on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for listening. And if you love this episode, share it with a friend.